was going on in the first half of chapter 11?
Living by faith.
Okay, now tell me about that.
That you, that you believe that God's going to do, you know that God's going to do something for you, before you do it.
Mm-hmm. And do you remember how he defined faith at the beginning of chapter 11?
It's confidence we humbly hope for and assurance without hope.
Okay, now we talked a little bit about that definition. Does that mean that you're taking a blind leap in the dark when you put your faith in God? No. Why not?
You have all the evidence.
Yes. And that's the argument that he's making through all of this is you have evidence of the character of God.
Mm-hmm.
So when God makes you a promise and you don't see the fulfillment of that promise right away, or maybe even after a long time, or maybe even in this lifetime, can you still trust him to fulfill that promise? It's a choice that you have to make, whether you're going to trust him to do what he says he's going to do when you don't see the fulfillment in the timing that you would like. But you have evidence of his faithfulness. And God's people have had to make this decision in every generation of believers has to decide if they are going to trust in the character of their God, if they're going to look at the evidence and say, this is who he is, this is what he's done, so this promise that he's made, if I don't see it fulfilled in the timing I would like, it's okay, because I trust him that he will do what he says. Now, we got a whole bunch of examples. Do you remember anything about the examples we saw last?
Abel,
Mm-hmm.
Enoch,
Yep.
Noah, and Abraham,
Mm-hmm.
Sarah,
Yep.
and these all died in faith, not having received that promise.
Right. So these are all people who are taking God at his word. They're trusting that the things he says he will do, he will do. Let's think on Abraham in particular, because we're going to carry on today with Isaac. So, how in particular did Abraham have to exercise faith? Abram. Okay.
Not to be competitive. Abram was a happy camper in the land of Ur, and God spoke to him and said, pack up your family and leave Ur. And I'll tell you as you go along your way where you're going.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
There's not even a destination
Yes.
offered in that request.
Yeah. So he had to decide whether he was going to do it. What else did Abraham do by faith? What did you say? What else? Did God promise? What else did Abraham have to trust in?
He was promised an heir, and then he was asked to sacrifice his heir.
That's right. So when he was promised a son, how long did that promise take? A long enough time that he and Sarah decided to help God out, right? It didn't work at all. And God didn't say, oh, well, okay, you just did your own thing. We won't bother with the promise. God's still going to do what he's going to do, right? So they wait a long time. They finally have Isaac, and then God says, okay, now sacrifice. What did the writer of Hebrews have to say about that choice that Abraham had to make regarding Isaac?
And counted it as righteousness.
He did count it as righteousness. What did the writer of Hebrews say about why Abraham was willing to do it?
Because he knew God could resurrect him if he wanted to.
How did he know that? He'd spent a long enough time walking with God by then, I think, to know the character and power of his God, and to know if God had promised to fulfill all these things through Isaac, then whatever he was asking him to do right now, God was still going to keep his promise. And he was going to keep it through Isaac. And Abraham had no idea how that was going to happen, but he reasoned, okay, if that means a resurrection, God can do it. But, I mean, how much does he have to trust the character of God to say, okay, I know he's going to keep this promise, even though I don't understand how he's going to do it.
Sally, the thing that stuck with me this whole time you've been gone is how he told the servant, you mentioned that, I've never seen that before. Told the servant, I'll be back, we'll be back.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I just, I had really picked up on that.
Okay, now, we'll carry on with Isaac in just a minute, but let me ask you, why is the author making this whole argument about faith in the promises of God to these particular leaders? How does this fit into the bigger argument of the whole book of Hebrews?
I'm surprised about that they're not trusting like they knew the law. They're just, well, we know what we're doing with that.
Right. So they want to go back to the things they can see, right? They want to go back to the stuff you don't have to take on faith. They want to go back to the Old Testament priesthood, the Old Testament sacrifices, the Old Testament temple, all that Old Covenant stuff. And I'm sure there's something in that that's really reassuring that you can touch it, see it, hear it, smell it. It's right there.
And it's just it's comfortable.
Because what are they experiencing having now embraced Christ? They're being persecuted. So why not just put Christ to the side? And anyway, the promises, that of the new kingdom and all that, it's taken a while. and here we are 2,000 years down the road. It still seems to be taking a while. And yet, the writer of Hebrews is saying to them, when you struggle to persevere, when you're being persecuted and you're looking for something to help you stand up under that, you don't get that from going back to the shadows just because they're tangible. You get that from being convinced that the character of your God is reliable. And again, every generation of believers has to make that choice. And the readers have to choose to. Are they going to stick with Christ, even when that means leaving off some of the stuff they're comfortable with, even if it means taking on persecution? Are they willing to do that? The only way you are going to be willing to do that is if you are absolutely convinced that God is going to keep his promises. And what are the promises that they and we are ultimately hanging on to? What are we looking forward to? What kind of eternity? With Jesus. And it's a new heavens, it's a new earth. We get all the inheritance, all the blessings, all the privileges of the firstborn son. If that's guaranteed to us through the promise of God, what could we lose in this lifetime that it's not the lose? And so there's the basis for perseverance, to know that your God is faithful. Okay, anything else you want to add from last time? Okay, so let's look at the second half of chapter 11. We're going to start in verse 20. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future. By faith, Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons and worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. By faith, Joseph, when his end was near, spoke about the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt and gave instructions about his bones. By faith, Moses' parents hid him for 3 months after he was born because they saw he was no ordinary child, and they were not afraid of the king's edict. By faith, Moses, when he had grown up, refused to be known as the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to be mistreated along with the people of God rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. He regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. By faith he left Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He persevered because he saw him who was invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of blood so that the destroyer of the firstborn would not touch the firstborn of Israel. By faith the people passed through the Red Sea as on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith the walls of Jericho fell after the people had marched around them for 7 days. By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. And what more shall I say? I do not have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, and gained what was promised, who shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fury of the flames, and escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, and who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. Others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, while still others were chained and put in prison. They were stoned, they were sawed in two, they were put to death by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, and mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, and in caves and holes in the ground. These were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect. Okay, so in verse 20, who's the next example of faith? Isaac, and what did he do by faith?
The twins, Jacob and Esau, regarding things to come.
Yes. Why did blessing his sons require faith?
Because he blessed Israel.
Yeah, and that's right. And in that blessing, it's not just saying, I hope things go well, right? When Isaac blesses his two sons, he's actually he's in the middle of these covenant promises that God has made. And he didn't see the fulfillment of all those promises from God, but he welcomed it from a distance. When he blesses his sons, it's in regard to their respective futures, which depend on God keeping his promises. Now, if you know the story of Jacob and Esau, you know there were serious conflicts between them. There were big difficulties between these two sons, particularly because of the deception by Jacob that reversed the birthright. If their futures had depended on their characters, they would have been goners. I mean, the beginning of that conflict between Jacob and Esau, you just expect it's going to come to a sticky end because things look really bad. And yet Isaac is blessing his sons in regards to their future, which requires him to trust the promises that God has made. There was no reason for any of them to become a great nation, but God said that they would. So despite all those obstacles, Isaac blesses his sons by faith, believing that God will be faithful and he will keep his promise.
But because he was deceived, I'm trying to wrestle this through. So is the faith and then blessing Esau? I guess they're both faith that he was deceived. He thought he was blessing, he was giving the birthright blessing to the son, right? So how is that? He still went on to bless the son. I just don't understand that.
Because I think in order for either one of them to have a future, he has to know that God will do what he says he's going to do.
And he'll uncramp, once he figures out the deceit, he's
Yeah.
God to figure that out.
That the covenant blessings of God are going to happen, even with all this mixed up whatever that's going on. The deception, the fact that Esau despises his birthright, that Jacob's a deceiver, that he's dishonest, that, I mean, if you're a parent looking at that, and you're thinking, what's the future hold for these two boys? Jail? I don't know. But here he is blessing them, and when you read through the blessings, it's not that everything that's going to come is going to be happy, but it's that he's confident they actually have a future. Where does he get that confidence from? From the promises.
And you know, he didn't get wrapped up in the bitterness of being deceived. Like we might.
And the thing too is that God had told him ahead of time, Jacob's the one. So there's a sense in which the fact that he's trying to give Esau the blessing, it's a natural thing to do, but he'd already been told it's not Esau who's going to be the one who gets the covenant blessings, it's Jacob. It's in Genesis, let me see, Genesis 27, and then Genesis 39 and 40. Okay, now, what about Jacob in verse 21? What does it say about him?
He blessed Joseph's sons.
Yep, when he was dying, he blessed the sons of Joseph, and it's the same kind of issue. Jacob didn't see the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham, that they would possess the land, that they'd be this great nation. But he did see the multiplication of his children. So he has 12 sons. He sees the establishment of those sons as the heads of the tribes of Israel. Now, what about those 12 sons? They were stand-up guys. I mean, it's still bad. When you read about the 12 sons of Jacob, if they'd been left to their own devices, they might well have just destroyed each other too. I mean, they sold Joseph. They sold him off, and
Some wanted to kill him.
yeah,
He got talked out of it.
yes, And they were guilty of murder and dishonesty and all kinds of things, Simeon, Levi, Judah. But in contrast to the scheming and deception that characterized his early life, Jacob trusted God for the future of his sons. He blessed them and their descendants by faith. And specifically it mentions here that he blesses the sons of Joseph, and worshipped the Lord even as he was dying. Now, why the particular mention of Joseph? Because he's the one who comes next. So, what does it say about Joseph in 22?
He told the Israelites that he wanted his own business and
That's right. So the end of Genesis, when they're all in Egypt, Joseph is there, his father, his brothers, all their families, their residents in Egypt, their families are growing and settling there. How in the world are they going to get that many people back to Canaan? I mean, like how could, and the thing is, it's going to be centuries before it happens, so there's going to be way more people when the time comes than there are even when Joseph is settled there. How would you get an entire nation of people out of Egypt? Well, Joseph doesn't know. He doesn't know how all of that's going to happen. He doesn't know when it's going to happen. But when he's nearing his death, he's confident it is going to happen somehow. And he trusts the Lord that there will be some way that the Lord will get the descendants of Israel out of Egypt and back into the land he promised them. And because of that, he gives instructions to them about what to do with his bones. He says, when it comes, and it's going to be 4 centuries before it comes, but when it comes, he says, take my bones back because I want to be buried in the place that God promised.
And they remembered.
They did.
Yeah,
because it does mention, when they leave Egypt, it does mention in Exodus that they take the bones of Joseph. That's right. So just as with his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, Joseph was confident God would keep his word, that he would take Israel out of Egypt, and that he would settle them in the land of Canaan. Okay, now we skip ahead to the time when God brings Israel out. So who does he mention next in 23? And first, Moses' parents, right? What do they do by faith? What does faith have to do with Moses' parents?
They did him and they weren't afraid of his food.
Yeah. So the king had decreed that all the baby boys of Israel should be killed. But Moses' parents recognized there was something unusual about him. They knew that only God could rescue him, and they trusted him. So they hid him by faith, believing that God would protect and deliver him. And no doubt they were risking their own lives when they did that, when they spent 3 months defying the edict of Pharaoh, but they feared God more than they feared the king. They trusted God for their future as well as for themselves. I don't know how much they knew of what Moses would do in the future, but they trusted God to take care of them. Now, what did faith look like then in the life of Moses in 24 to 28?
This one is, I think, very interesting. Moses was taken from his Israelite family and raised in the palace of Pharaoh, and that somewhere along the line, he was taught about God. Certainly not by Pharaoh's son. And he becomes the champion of the Israelite people because of his faith in God.
And what is it that he sets aside in order to identify with the people of his faith?
Becoming the king of Egypt.
All the wealth, all the status, the position, everything that went along with that. All the privileges of being the grandson of Pharaoh. He had all of that, and he turned away from it, and he trusted the promise of God instead. The promise that the future of Israel did not lie in Egypt. And his future was with Israel, not with the Egyptians. So he could have taken advantage of that whole situation and just enjoyed himself, but he had a longer-term perspective because of the promise of God. So instead of just settling into the pleasure of sin for a short time, he identified with his people, with God's people, the slave nation. He identified with them and endured the suffering and mistreatment that came from the Egyptians.
Seems like it, a
a type of Christ in a way, although Moses could have enjoyed the pleasures of passing sin, but the passing pleasures of sin, but Christ didn't do that. But he could have remained in his royal heaven, but yet he lowered himself, abased himself to become, live with us and suffer.
And since you mentioned Christ, what does it say in verse 20?
Talks about the reproach of Christ, that he considers the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures of Egypt. He's looking to the eternal reward.
Yeah. What does that mean? Moses didn't know who Christ was.
It goes back to his parents who, I think, who just invested that time that God had allowed in their life, and it's such a illustration for us as parents to do the same at that early age.
When were they allowed to do that? He was just infant, wasn't he?
Well,
She got to nurse
got to
him.
nurse him and care for
2 or
him.
3 years.
To me,
I don't know how long it was, but
in my way of thinking, it just points out the sovereignty of God, and God has his hand upon Moses before the foundation of the world.
and his parents.
It strikes me that the writer of Hebrews calls all of that identifying with the cause of Christ, when Moses has never heard that name mentioned. Why is it the cause of Christ? Because the deliverance of God's people out of bondage, is it not a foreshadowing of the gospel? And Moses fully embraced his role in it, which was to be the mediator. Right? He's not the ultimate mediator. He's the foreshadow of the mediator. Now, he doesn't know the story of Jesus, but being willing to suffer because of his faith in God's promises is equivalent to suffering for and with Christ, precisely because of the particular role that he has in this event that is an enormous foreshadow of what Christ is going to do in the Exodus. So he considers the suffering and everything that comes then from the promises of God. He considers all of that to be of greater value than whatever wealth Egypt had to offer. Because, the writer says, he was looking ahead to something better. He was looking ahead to a reward beyond his life. So without even knowing who Christ was, he was choosing to suffer on his behalf by identifying with the people of Israel and doing what God told him to do. And then, verse 27, it could refer to Moses' exile in Midian or to the Exodus itself, but whatever the case, Moses could have given in to the fear of Pharaoh's anger and refused to leave Egypt. Instead, he trusted God to keep his word. And because he feared the living God more than he feared the king of Egypt, he left in spite of everything that Pharaoh might try to do to him. One fear drove out another. And you notice the paradox right there, that it says Moses saw him who is invisible. You can't see what's invisible. What do you think the author's getting at when he says that?
The one true God, not an idol.
It's true. And I think that the living God was more real to Moses than the visible gods, the idols of Egypt. He saw him in the sense that God was more real to him and more to be feared than Pharaoh or any of those other false gods. And because of that, he persevered. And so when God told him how to survive the final plague and how to save the firstborn of Israel from judgment and destruction, he did it. I mean, it took faith for him and all of the people of Israel to hear that instruction from the Lord that said, kill the lamb, paint the blood on your doorposts, and then the judgment will pass by you. But they did it. Obeying God about the Passover was an act of faith, and God kept his word, and he passed over judgment. But then, when it came time for Israel to leave Egypt, how in the world would that happen? How would they get out? So, what does he mention in verse 29?
Parting in the Red Sea.
How did they get away from the Egyptian army?
On dry land.
God drowned the Egyptians.
Just think about the irony of that. If God were to tell the people of Israel ahead of time, I'm going to get you out of Egypt, and don't worry about Pharaoh's army because they're going to drown in the desert. Right? Nobody, like, what are you talking about? And yet that's exactly what the Lord's going to do. He doesn't tell them how he's going to do it. He just says, get up and go where I tell you to go. And they're going to have to trust him to take off out into the desert, out into the wilderness, not knowing how he's going to deliver them from Pharaoh and from the Egyptian army. But he's got a plan, and he will do it. And he does it with the Red Sea.
I've
So-
noticed that when I read Bible stories to Remy, it's like looking at it a whole another way for me, because you say, it's just like, like, I said, oh, they're coming after the Israelites, and what are they going to do? And she's like, oh, dry land. God opened up the water, dry land.
Wow.
And it's just like, it just seems so impossible when you're reading it during like David and Goliath. Like, we're always having problems. Yeah, that's an alley.
I don't realize that, what you were saying. It's like God tells us to do something in his word, and we're like, well, how's that going to work? We start questioning and wondering. It doesn't make sense to us, but he tells us, he commands us, and he wants us to be obedient to that command.
I heard a preacher not long ago who said, well, he gave an example of his son. He said when he was in his 30s, he had a son who was like 7. And he told his son to do something, and his son was like, well, explain to me why. and he said, why do you need an explanation? The explanation is, I'm 37 and you're 7. and he wasn't just saying, because I'm an adult and I say so, what he was saying was, I can't possibly explain to you all of the reasons why you need to do this. You need to do it because you trust me. And he said, are we not that way with God? When you say to God, I'll obey you if I understand, what you're really saying is, I don't trust you. I trust me, right? If I get it, if it makes sense to me, okay, then I'll obey. Rather than saying, I trust God, and that means I don't have to understand how he's going to work this out. I just have to trust him. And that's the choice the Israelites have to make. They head out into the wilderness with the army of Pharaoh behind them. Are they going to trust him to do it? Are they going to wait until they know how it's going to happen? Yeah, trust him. And the thing, too, that you notice here is that contrast between the Egyptians and the Israelites. The Israelites followed him, right? Faith was the difference between Israel and Egypt at the Red Sea. Not just believing they could cross through, because the Egyptians believed that, but actually entrusting themselves to the Lord, that's what Israel did. The Egyptians were not trusting the Lord, but the Israelites were. Okay, now for reasons that are probably obvious, the author skips the 40 years that Israel wandered in the wilderness and moves on to the time of Joshua. So what does he say in verse 30?
They didn't even have to do battle. All they had to do was march around the city and blow their trumpets and sing. Well, first they marched around the city singing. And on the seventh day, well, the first 6 days they marched around the city. And the last day they marched around the trumpets. The walls of the city fell down. Now, you have to remember that these huge cities, or whatever cities in the desert, were built out of stone walls. And usually the walls had rooms in them. So they're like a double wall. And the walls just fell down.
And remember who the Israelites are. They're a slave nation. They don't come out well armed,
No,
right?
no,
They don't have
no, they
siege
don't have to
weapons.
fight.
They're not like the ancient equivalent of the Navy SEALs. They're coming out with nothing. And they're supposed to conquer a fortified city. that has limestone walls big enough to live in. There's no way that Israel is powerful enough to conquer not only Jericho, but any of the other fortified cities in Canaan. There's no way they can do it. They have to trust God to do for them what they can't possibly do for themselves. And that is so clear at Jericho. It's the first stop on their military campaign. They've come to this city that's completely impenetrable, but the walls of Jericho fell without the Israelites lifting a sword. I mean, when you read the account in Joshua, they really just go in and do the mop-up work. You know, God reduces it to rubble, and they just go and take what's there. They believed what God said, they obeyed his commands, and God brought down the walls and conquered the city.
We gotta give this message to
Now, in verse 31, then you get a really interesting example. Who gets added in verse? And I was about to say, what's unusual about that, but you just said that. Right? What's unusual about this example? Because Rahab is a woman, a Gentile, and a prostitute. And the author holds her up as an example of faith. Why?
She believed God and knew that they were gonna take it over the Israel.
And so what did she do? Because she believed that.
She did this fine.
Yeah, that's right. Now, there's, again, an important distinction right there. Everybody in Canaan heard the reports about God. They knew what the God of Israel had done to the Egyptians. When you read in Joshua, it said they were all melting in fear because they knew about Israel's God. But the difference is that Rahab decided to entrust herself to that God. It's not just that she believed the reports, it's that she said, okay, I'm going to belong to him then. I'm going to hand myself over to him. And when she puts her trust in Israel's God, the evidence of that is welcome in response. So, because of her faith, she lived while the disobedient and the unfaithful.
And she was part of the genealogy.
Actually marries into the people of God and becomes part of the genealogy of Jesus. Okay, now in summarizing this section, who else does the author mention in 32?
Gideon, the one.
Yep.
Samson and David.
Yep.
Barak and Jephthah.
Now, I don't know if you know about all of these guys. What do you know about them? I mean, when you read that list of names, what's your impression of those names?
Some of those guys kind of not really, I don't really see. As I read it, it's like, do they really have faith in God, or are they just doing their own thing?
He chooses a mixed bag of men right here. And I think he does it on purpose. So he mentions just in passing men from the time of the judges and a king and a prophet. What's interesting is that some of them were really not stand-up kinds of guys. Gideon was a coward turned vengeance seeker. Barak was a reluctant skeptic who got shown up by a woman. Jephthah sacrificed his daughter. And Samson was actually more like a Philistine than he was an Israelite. David committed adultery and murder. I mean, to say that these guys were imperfect is an understatement. Why do you think the author would include them here? I know that this chapter is often called Heroes of the Faith. The people in this chapter are not heroes. There's one hero in this chapter, and the hero is God. But the people in the faith in the chapter are not heroes. They are people, and they're not moral examples either. They are people who, at some point, had to decide whether they were going to bank everything on what God had said. And these are all people who were examples of that at some point or another. They were sinners, and some of them did horrible things, and yet all of them came to a point where they had to decide, are they going to trust God to come through? And they did it. And amazing things happened on the other side of that. But when we come to this passage, to this entire chapter, what stands out is not the faithfulness of the people, it's the faithfulness of God. And how how generation after generation after generation, he demonstrated himself to be faithful because people deserved it? Did Samson deserve it? Samson is like, you read it and you're like, this guy, really? God wasn't faithful to Samson because Samson deserved it. God was faithful to Samson because he's a faithful God. And that's the thing that the readers need to know, is God is faithful. And if he's faithful, then why am I not trusting him? Why would I not put all of my trust in the fact that he would keep his word? So, here are examples of faith because they were willing to trust a promise God had made to his people. They had to trust that God would do something they couldn't yet see, but based on the evidence of what they knew before, they trusted him. And because they trusted him to keep his word, what did they and others accomplish by faith? In 33 and 34.
Conquered kingdoms, they enforced justice, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouth of lions, they quenched the power of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword, they were made strong out of weakness, they became mighty in war, and they put corn out of flock.
So Gideon conquered the Midianites because he was a great guy.
No.
Because he trusted the word of God.
Didn't God have him reduce his army down to 300 men?
Yeah, and it even took him a while. You're right, it even took him a while to convince him to do it, right? But yes, he starts out with this army, and God just keeps getting it smaller and smaller and smaller in order to make it clear who's winning this battle. It's God who's doing it, not Gideon. But the fact that he trusts God to step in and do it is why all of that happens. Jephthah, he's a real dodgy guy, but Jephthah defeated the Ammonites because he trusted God to fight for him. Samson, who's even dodgier than Jephthah, started the judgment against God's judgment against the Philistines. Again, not because he was a stand-up guy, but because God was using him. And the fact that he stepped out, even at the end of his life, that he prayed and said, okay, God, one last time, could you do this? Is that not an act of faith? That the God of Israel can do what he said all those years before he would do for Israel. So, yeah, because they trusted God, they conquered enemy kingdoms, they administered God's justice. David did that, Samuel did that. They gained provisional fulfillments of what God had promised to his people, like the possession of the land of Canaan, victory over their enemies. There were also those who put their faith in God and they escaped instances of certain death. So I know you think about when he says they shut the mouths of lions, right? I mean, everybody thinks about Daniel. They quenched the flames. They think about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They escaped execution. Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, Mordecai, and Esther. There's a lot of additional examples in the Old Testament, but also in the intertestamental period, the 400 silent years between Malachi and Matthew. There are also examples of people who did that. People who were weak, but they were made strong through the strength of God. Sometimes physically, sometimes figuratively. I mean, God has this habit of calling weak people for his own purposes. But because they trusted God's word, he intervened, and they became powerful in times of battle. They defeated enemy armies. What does the author add in verse 35?
Does this shift to the New Testament a little bit?
Where-
Well, there were women in
That's the
the Old
widow.
Testament.
Did Elijah.
Yeah, they laid
David.
on the child, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So Elijah and Elisha both, there were sons of mothers in their times who received, well, the sons died and the mothers received them back.
Yeah.
They trusted God for impossible things, and he did the impossible. And then through faith, after they received the dead back, they all lived happily ever after the end. What does he add in the second half of that verse?
Torture.
Yeah. All of a sudden, there's a shift. Right here, there's a significant shift in the chapter because it's very different now from what came before. The author's now going to emphasize the suffering and the struggles that come with faith. Having faith doesn't mean that God will make everything happy for you. Often faith means persevering in difficult circumstances that never change, or that cause you pain, or even that end your life. The people in the second half of this verse trusted God that there was a life after this one, and that he had the power to bring them back from the dead. Not a temporary extension of this life, like the sons of those widows had, but a permanent life following a better resurrection. And I think this describes well, too, the experience of a lot of the Jews in the intertestamental period. There were people during the time of the Maccabees who, I don't know if you've ever read anything about the people who lived under the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes between Malachi and Matthew. The Maccabees were a family of Jews who stood against the attempt to basically insert idol worship at the temple of the Lord. So Antiochus Epiphanes was a Greek ruler, maybe he was certain, but he was trying basically to outlaw Judaism, and so he had him sacrifice a pig on the altar at Jerusalem, and he wanted to turn him to the worship of Zeus. And there's this Jewish family, the Maccabees, who stood up against that, and they suffered horrible things because of that. I mean, if you ever read, it's in the Apocrypha, if you ever read the Second Maccabees, don't read it before you go to bed at night, because it's really brutal, the things that happened. But they would not turn away from the Lord. They endured terrible torture and death, and they refused to turn away from what God had said. They just wouldn't turn away from His word.
Thus, there goes the prosperity
That's
gospel.
right. That's right. And what sorts of struggles did other people face in 36 to 38?
You jeered, flogging, chained, prison, stoned to death, saved in, sawed in two, and killed by the sword, dressed in only sheepskin, and goat skin, destitute, persecuted, mistreated, wandered in the deserts and mountains, and lived in caves and holes in the ground.
Faith in the promises of God, that assurance of things not seen, made people willing to suffer in really astonishing ways. Like, why would you suffer that way if you were not convinced there was something better coming that you could trust? So you just think about people being abused verbally, all the mocking, the jeering, the beatings, chain and imprisonment. It says some were killed by stoning. Tradition says Jeremiah was. That's not in the Bible, but Jewish tradition says they stoned him. And certainly there were people in the New Testament too. I mean, think about Stephen, for example. Some were cut in two. Tradition says Isaiah was. Again, that's not included in the biblical text, but Jewish tradition says that King Manasseh killed Isaiah by doing that. Lots of people were killed by the sword, which is just a reference to government or military execution. It's a really striking contrast to what came before, that by faith some people lived and conquered, and by faith some people died, and died, some of them, really terrible deaths. And then they were fleeing persecution, they became outcasts, they were poverty-stricken and mistreated, they were homeless, lived wherever they could find shelter. And the assumption of an onlooker would be that they were not worthy to live as citizens in normal society. In fact, that's how they were treated by a lot of the people in power. What does the author say about them?
The world is not worthy of them.
Yeah. To say the world's not worthy to have them as citizens. Can you imagine being in a country where you're like, I'm too good for this country? I don't know. Maybe sometimes you feel like that. I don't know. But this idea that here's the world they live in and they're too good for it. Not because they are necessarily moral, upstanding people, but because their faith is in God. And when their faith is in Him, they are willing to undergo astonishing things because they trust in Him. Now, how does the author conclude all of that in 30 minutes?
They didn't receive promised land.
Right? But they were commended for their faith. Right? A number of people in this list saw bits of fulfillment, but none of them actually received the full promise of God. but they were commended for their faith, and there was nothing in their situation that made them actually miss out on the promises of God. Rather, God, in his sovereignty, waited until a later time to bring about the full realization of his promises. Why? What does it say in verse 40?
They could be made
He had something better planned that involved both them and us being made perfect. What was the something better? Jesus was. It's Christ in the gospel. The better plan that God was always looking ahead toward. That it was a better hope with better promises, a better covenant, better sacrifices, a better abiding possession, a better resurrection. All of that comes through Christ. That's where all of it was headed. That's their heritage, and it's ours. And actually, we're going to talk more about that next week. Now, they were looking ahead to Christ. We are looking back to Christ. But we still have things that we are looking ahead to by faith, right? What is it now that we're waiting for by faith if Christ has already come? That's right. That's right. The full realization of God's kingdom and all the blessings that come with it. We actually have an advantage over all of those people who came before, because we know how God fulfilled that promise to Abraham through Christ. We know how it is that he intervenes to bring his son into the world. All these things from the Old Testament that you just think, how in the world is God going to pull that off? Jesus is how he's going to pull it off, and we know that he did that. But we still, too, have to make this decision now to trust his promises, to trust his word, and to live by faith. Okay, now, how are those examples relevant to the readers and to us?
I have a question.
Okay.
Faith. Well, sometimes the message is if you have faith, it's going to happen. And then it don't happen, and the people think that his promises were not true, or he didn't do it. Because we know we have a powerful God. If his will is going to happen. But what is the difference between hope and faith? You know what I mean? Like, I hope, honestly, God will help me with this. But having faith that he is all powerful to do it, and then his will intervene. So in that I have a kind of conflict.
Faith is trusting him.
No matter what.
Yes. And when you think about people saying, I have faith that this will happen, and then it doesn't happen, so they get disillusioned. What do you think about that? Did God fail?
No, he's got something different or better.
That's right.
He renewed the focus.
Yeah. So the first question is, what promise are you trusting him for? Because I think there are a lot of people who decide for themselves, this is what I want to happen. So I'm going to pray, and then I'm going to have faith that God will do what I want him to do. And then when he doesn't do it, they're like, oh, God doesn't keep his promises. Well, God didn't actually promise you that, did he? Did God promise that he would, give you a perfect husband and perfect children and the exact job that you want, and that he would heal you of this particular disease? And he's capable of doing all of that, but he hasn't promised to do all of those things for us. And so I think sometimes people try to claim in faith things that God hasn't actually promised. And so then you're not trusting God, you're trusting your agenda with God, which is different. You make your own plan and then say, okay, God, be my accomplice. And then when he won't be your accomplice, then you get upset.
I understand that what the people say. For example, they go to the Bible, says, if you ask, you will receive.
Right.
Okay? And by his womb, we have been healed. You know what I mean? So they take these Bible verses and they believe on that. But, and then whatever, what happens. So how do you tell that person that God still has, a plan, even if that loved person died,
So how can you do that?
I
How
think
can
you
explain?
point people to Jesus, because Jesus did the same thing. There were, I think this is the temptation in the wilderness for Jesus, is for Satan to come along and say, okay, you're going to have to force the issue now with God. Does he love you or doesn't he? Are you the beloved Son of God or aren't you? Okay, let's prove it. Are you testing God or are you trusting him? Because testing him is actually the opposite of trusting. And I think that's what lots of people are doing, is they're testing God instead of trusting him. Because if you trust him, what you're saying is, I'm coming to you, God, for what I think is good, but you know better than I do. And I'm going to trust you to give me what you know I should have, even if it's not what you think I should have. Do I trust me more or do I trust you? Where is your trust really? Is it in the goodness of God, or is it in God to do what you want, which is not his will? And you have to know where you're headed. You have to know that there's a long-term perspective on some of these things, because we are going to die. Unless Jesus comes again, we are going to die without seeing the fulfillment of all the things that God has promised. So do we believe that there really is a new heavens and a new earth, and that that's what we're headed for? And if God doesn't give us all the answers to prayer that we want right now, ultimately it's okay, because what are we going to lose now that we're not going to get back in spades on the other side? Thank you. All right, anything else you want to mention? Any other comments?
Well, I was thinking of the poem, because she asked the difference between hope and faith,
Okay.
and Emily Dickinson has this little poem that I really like. And it says, hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul, that sings a tune without words and never stops at all. And it goes on. Anyway, it's just kind of a poetic way of looking at hope, and it perches in the soul, never stops at all. Tune without words. It's a kind of different way of looking at it, but somehow it makes sense to me. And millions of others, people like Emily Dickinson.
That's one of my favorite quotes from him.
Yeah, she has a lot of really good ones.
So, did God speak audibly to Abram or Abraham when he told him to kill Isaac?
I'd have to go back and look. I assume he did, but I don't know. He does in the movies.
Oh, that's true.
Because I'm wondering, like with us, we don't often, at least no one I know has heard God speak audibly. I know he speaks through his word and through sermons and other believers and stuff, but how do we know for sure what God is saying? Like I just know a lot of people that go on emotion, or I felt this, and yesterday I felt like I needed to give some money to this young struggling mom in the grocery store, and I was like, is this God saying it or is it me? And I was wrestling with that, like, is this an impression from God, and how do I know if it's from God? Ultimately I walked up and gave her the money because I thought it's not going to hurt me either way, whether it's God or whether it's me just giving this mom a little cash to buy her groceries. Either way, it's not going to hurt me and it's going to bless her. But I was like, was that God or was that me? I wrestle with that, because did he put the thought in my head or was it already there? Did I?
It's in your heart.
Yeah.
It's in your heart.
Yeah.
Always.
But was he asking me to give that lady some money, or did I just look at her situation and think she's a young mom with lots of kids and she could really use some grocery money?
Well, who do you think put that thought in your head?
Yeah, you think Satan did?
No. I know, but then people would say, like, God told me to do this
Oh.
for you, and should I say God told me to do this, or I just wanted to do this for
Then
you?
God will bless her no matter where.
Yeah.
And that's all you have to say is God
Yeah.
bless you with it. Last night, I had more or less the same thing happen. I was in the grocery store, but I needed to Venmo something to my grandchild, and I thought, well, should I do this? I need to look at my, everything, I need to go back and make sure I can do this. And I thought, if God placed this on my heart, who else is going to do this? Will this be for His glory, or is this for mine? And do I trust God for what He has given to me in provision? Then I need to give it back to the Lord and trust Him, So,
I'm very hesitant about ever saying God told me this.
yeah.
Me too.
Because I'm fallible and I could be wrong, and I don't, to speak on behalf of God something He didn't say is a very serious thing in Scripture. So there are times when I think that God is leading me in this direction, or I think that this is something God wants me to do, but I think that's different from saying God told me to do this. And one of the problems I think with doing that, maybe you're not saying that to other people, maybe you're just saying it yourself, but it is so open for manipulation. Because when you say to somebody else, God told me this, what you're doing is saying, and don't disagree with me, or you're disagreeing with God, right? I had a friend when I was in college who, this guy kept asking her out, and she didn't want to go out with him. And he tried every possible thing he could think of, and finally he was like, God told me that you're supposed to go out with me. Well, that's kind of an obvious one, but aren't people doing that all the time? Aren't they claiming, they're playing the God card to say this is what I should do and don't argue about it? And my friend was like, well, when he tells me, I'll say yes. Until then, it's not what you mean, And a lot of times that's not what we're trying to do. We really are trying to discern the direction of God, but I'm always very cautious about saying God told me this. God can turn my heart like a water course the same way He did Nebuchadnezzar and Cyrus and whoever else, and I pray, that He leads me in that way, and then you make the decision that you think is best, particularly if it's not a moral issue where the Scripture has something to say about it. He's given you the freedom to make those decisions. And you might think, okay, I think this is what God wants me to do, so I'm going to step out and I'm going to do it, and I'm going to trust Him to bless it because I'm not doing something wrong. But yeah, to claim that God said to do this is a little sticky.
Can I
Yeah.
share this? Wow. I had been doing my lesson, and I just thought, this whole time I didn't want to forget it and then come to Bible study and then go, where are we now? So I've just really been devouring this. So I walked, and I've chosen to walk because of this beautiful weather. And that's my prayer time as I walk the dog. And I have been praying specifically for a grandchild. And as I'm walking, I'm praying, Lord, you know the situation, And then it suddenly thought of Abraham. Now, Abraham, he trusted God for things he didn't see. He wasn't around. I didn't have to be around. And then suddenly I realized I just need to start thanking God for what He's going to do. This is exciting. I know He's going to do this because look at Scripture. That's how God spoke to me through my study and through even telling me, don't go there, Susan. That's not right. You need to trust me and to start thanking me. And that's what I'm talking about. I didn't hear anything visible, but I drew out the Holy Spirit to take what He's teaching me and bring it to fruit in my own life. And I know, I'm so excited. I don't even have to be here. I think of my mother's prayers. And she prayed for her grandchildren. And the things that the things that are happening now in my grandchildren's life, that I get to see as the daughter, seeing how she prayed for my children. Thank you, Lord.
And then it's also worth thinking too, what do we mean when we say that something is God's will? And how do we measure that? Because I think sometimes you come to a decision you have to make and you think, I want to do God's will. In my own case, I think sometimes what I really want is for everything to turn out right and well. I want a good outcome to this. Could it be that you would pray for God's wisdom and then you would make a decision that turns out very badly? And that could be God's will. I mean, is it possible that you could end up in a really terrible situation on the other side of that decision and still be not out of God's sovereign will? I mean, he can lead you into really difficult, painful things, even if after you spend a whole lot of time praying, what should I do, in which direction I should go. The easiest way is not necessarily, yeah. That's right.
I have a really good verse. My heater broke down this winter, and Marilyn's husband John brought over these space heaters, so that was really nice. So I had heat because it was really cold. But anyway, God gave me this verse from Proverbs 2:10 and 11. And I think in Lindsay's case, it's just discernment, discretion. It says, for wisdom will enter your heart, and knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. Discretion will guard you, and understanding will watch over you. And so I kept that on my microwave for quite a while. I'm about ready to move on to another verse. that is so important. That, knowledge will be pleasant to your soul. To know the right thing to do. And Lindsay just innately knew the right thing to do because it's in her heart, and discretion will guard you. So he'll give you discretion on whether to, like I get asked to take people far away to medical appointments a lot, and I have to say no sometimes. And you have to use discretion. Do I do it? Do I don't do it? Do I do it for everybody and forget myself and my needs? So you kind of have to balance it out.
And sometimes God just gives you the freedom
Yeah.
to make that decision. I mean, I think that's one of the things Paul gets at when he says, when you give what you've settled in your heart to give. Of course, pray. I mean, ask God, what would you have me to give? But ultimately what Paul says is give what you can give cheerfully. Okay, God's given you the freedom to do that. So you can stand in this situation and say, well, God, show me what to give. And you can say, this is what I settled in my heart to give. If you want me to give more than that, change my heart,
Well, it's not the cheerful gift.
Yeah, there is freedom to make those decisions. And, so it's not a moral kind of issue.
And I think, speaking personally, 77, and I think it's a good decision for her.
I'm glad to hear. I mean, I'm not glad for you, but I'm just.
And it's like, and so I can choose to wallow in that sea of defeat, or say, okay, Lord, I'm thinking of refining fire. It's like, keep plowing forward, confess, say I blew it, there's a consequence to that, I keep thinking there are different sins, actions that cause consequences, some are more serious than others, but he hasn't abandoned me. My tendency is to pull and say, just hide everything I know, okay, he's gonna, and this is the pardon open. and he's wanting, I just think more and more, and this has been a very affirming lesson with your enlightening mother. It's like, you're still gonna make mistakes. And especially just like you said, these subs, not Dawn. Just do it. He thinks that at this moment because I talk more than he does. But he's just so faithful to us. He's the faithful one, and in spite of,
Even when we make the wrong decision, he's with us.
exactly.
And I was just thinking of the navigation system, you know, when you miss your turn.
Rerouting. Over and over. Turn at the next corner and go back. Circle around.
Well, and you know that even when you make stupid decisions, it's not like God is saying,
Oh,
okay, what now?
He's not
Yeah.
exactly. I didn't have a contingency for that.
And to a certain extent, every plan is plan A, not plan B or C or D. Because God, in His sovereignty, will redeem things for your good, won't He? Even the stupid things you do, the sin that comes up in your life, God will redeem all of those things for your good. And He will conform you to the image of Christ. And there should be a peace and a rest in that, okay, I'm going to make the best decision I can, but even if I make a mess of it, God's sovereignty isn't going to fail me.
There's nothing leads me.
No?
And another thing that comforts me is that he has your spirit. And so, that brings you peace. Which means stuff.
What's that verse in mind? All things work together for the good of those who love God and are called to His purpose. He calls us in our lives to bring us closer to Him.
Something I read this week is that joy is eternal and suffering is new. And I thought about that.
Suffering is what?
Something like that, yeah. Joy is eternal and suffering is new. And it's for this time, if we keep our eyes on His joy, that we,
And I think
it's
there's,
meant to refine us.
right, and I think there's a sense in which the joy on the other side of that is more intense because of suffering.
Absolutely.
Going through suffering makes you
And
appreciate
that's why we
things
have
deep and deeper.
What I meant that was is that suffering is linked to us
For a time.
for a time.
Okay. All right.